The Romanovs, the dynasty. Den a closed den. Scientists found bones buried in a forest outside Yekaterinburg, Russia, and when the results came back, they closed one of the most debated mysteries of the 20th century. But to understand what the science resolved, you have to understand what happened in the early hours of July 17, 1918. Tsar Nicholas II had been the ruler of the Russian Empire, one of the largest nations on earth, until March 1917, when revolution forced his abdication. He and his family were placed under house arrest, then moved east as the Bolshevik government consolidated power and the Russian Civil War intensified. By the summer of 1918, they were held in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, in the Ural Mountains, a building the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. The family consisted of 11 people: the Tsar, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, their son and heir Alexei, the family physician Dr. Eugene Botkin, and 3 servants who had refused every offer to leave. In the middle of the night on July 16th to 17th, they were woken and told to dress. They were brought to the basement for their own protection, as fighting was approaching the city. A photograph would be taken, they were told. What followed was chaotic and prolonged. When it was over, all 11 people were dead. The bodies were transported deep into the Koptyaki forest. Efforts were made to conceal them. The locations were not publicly recorded, and the Soviet state maintained silence about the fate of the remains for more than 70 years. The mystery that followed was not whether the Romanovs had died. The Bolshevik government confirmed the Tsar's death within days. The mystery was whether all of them had, and whether the 2 youngest children in particular had somehow been separated from the others and survived. That question would fuel a century of speculation, several imposters, and one of the most consequential applications of forensic DNA science in the history of criminal investigation. Archival records found in Soviet-era files, documents that were classified for decades and only became accessible after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, described the disposal of the bodies in enough detail to give researchers a starting point. But the physical evidence, when searchers finally looked, told a story with a gap in it. The first serious effort to locate the burial site was made in 1979, not by government authorities, but by a group of amateur investigators who had pieced together enough information from surviving witnesses and documentary sources to identify a probable location in the Koptyaki forest outside Yekaterinburg. They found a burial site and confirmed human remains, but kept the discovery secret during the Soviet period for their own safety. When the USSR dissolved, the site was formally excavated in 1991. Forensic archaeologists recovered the skeletal remains and brought them to a laboratory for analysis. The condition of the bones was poor, acid had been applied, and the remains had spent more than 7 decades in forest soil. But enough material was recovered to attempt identification. The count was 9. 9 sets of remains from a group of 11. 2 people were unaccounted for. Based on the age characteristics of the bones and cross-referenced against Soviet disposal records, forensic analysis indicated the missing individuals were the youngest son, Alexei, who was 13, and one of the daughters, either Anastasia, 17, or Maria, 19. The gap in the physical record sustained speculation that predated the excavation and continued long after it. If 2 bodies were not present, the possibility remained, for those who wished to believe it, that 2 people had escaped. And the story, already circulating for more than 70 years, of a young woman who appeared in Berlin in 1920, claiming to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, suddenly had new fuel. Court records found in German and American archives document one of the longest and most expensive legal disputes over personal identity in the history of the 20th century. A case that lasted more than 30 years and was ultimately resolved not by a judge, but by a DNA test. In February 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after an apparent attempt to take her own life. She refused to identify herself and was committed to a psychiatric institution. After approximately 18 months, she told staff that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and that she had survived the events in Yekaterinburg. She became known publicly as Anna Anderson, a name assigned while her identity remained disputed. She maintained her claim for the remaining 64 years of her life, through 2 continents and one of the longest identity lawsuits in modern legal history. The case attracted intense international attention. Some European royals, who had personally known the real Anastasia, accepted Anderson's claim after meeting her. Others, including relatives closest to the Romanov children, consistently and categorically rejected it. The physical similarities were ambiguous enough to sustain belief, not definitive enough to resolve it. A lawsuit filed in German courts in 1938 was argued through multiple retrials until 1970, when the German Federal Court finally declined to rule either way, acknowledging the case could not be decided on available evidence. The story became a major Hollywood film. Books presented her claim as credible or proven. The narrative of the surviving princess entered popular culture so completely it was treated, in many quarters, as historical fact rather than unresolved claim. Anna Anderson died in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 1984. She left behind, unknowingly, the means to finally answer the question she had spent her life posing. Forensic scientists found, in 1993, that the bones recovered from the Koptyaki Forest burial site could be matched to members of the Romanov family using a DNA technique that had been refined only in the preceding decade, and that the key to the identification lay in the bloodline connecting the Russian imperial family to the British royal house. The challenge was the condition of the samples. Acid had been applied to the remains in 1918. They had spent more than 70 years in damp forest soil. Standard nuclear DNA profiling was not reliable. The team, led by British forensic scientist Dr. Peter Gill, turned to mitochondrial DNA, genetic material inherited exclusively through the maternal line, more abundant in cells and significantly more resistant to degradation over time. The critical reference sample came from Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Philip's maternal grandmother and Tsarina Alexandra had been sisters, making him a direct maternal line relative of the Romanov children. His mitochondrial sequence, if it matched the forest bones, would confirm a family connection. The comparison was made. The sequences matched. 5 individuals were positively identified: Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and 3 daughters. A technical complication arose. The Tsar's mitochondrial DNA showed heteroplasmy, the simultaneous presence of 2 slightly different sequences, which required verification via a living maternal line relative of Nicholas II. That relative was located and tested. The heteroplasmy was confirmed as an authentic inherited feature, not a laboratory artifact. The identifications were published in Nature in 1994. 76 years after the Ipatiev house, 5 members of the family were accounted for. 2 remained missing. Tissue samples found in a Virginia hospital's pathology archive, preserved for years after a routine medical procedure performed on Anna Anderson, became the material that settled the question she had spent 64 years arguing. When Anna Anderson died in 1984, a sample of intestinal tissue that had been retained from a medical procedure performed years earlier was still held in the archives of a hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia. The existence of this sample was identified by researchers in the mid-1990s, after the Romanov DNA results had been published and the question of Anderson's true identity had become directly testable for the first time. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from Anderson's tissue sample was sequenced and compared against two sets of reference DNA. The Romanov family sequence, established through Prince Philip's sample, and the DNA of a living maternal line relative of a woman named Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had disappeared from Berlin in early 1920, around the same time that the woman who would become Anna Anderson had appeared. The result was definitive on both counts. Anderson's DNA showed no match whatsoever to the Romanov mitochondrial sequence, and it matched precisely the sequence from the living relative of Franziska Szankowska. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. She was Franziska Szankowska, a woman who had survived a factory accident in Berlin in 1916, suffered serious head injuries, and subsequently lived in psychiatric institutions before emerging as the most famous false claimant in modern European history. Whether she had genuinely believed her own story or had constructed and maintained it deliberately, the DNA could not determine. What it determined was the fact. Archaeologists found, in August 2007, a second burial site in the Koptiaki forest, less than 70 meters from the first, and the fragments it contained were consistent with exactly the individuals who had been missing from the 1991 excavation. The discovery was made by a group of researchers following leads from a document recovered from Soviet archives. The written account of Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik official who had overseen the disposal of the bodies in 1918. Yurovsky's account, which had been suppressed for decades, described the process in operational detail. The main group had been buried at one location. Two bodies, he specified that they were burned and then buried separately, had been dealt with at a different spot nearby after the first burial site was deemed inadequate. The 2007 search team focused on the area described in the Yurovsky account. Using metal detectors and careful soil examination, they identified a disturbed area of ground and began a careful excavation. What they found was fragmentary, charred bone pieces, ceramic fragments, and other material consistent with an improvised cremation in a field pit. The bone fragments were small and heavily damaged by fire, which had been sustained and intense, but there were enough of them to extract basic biological information. The assessment of the physical remains indicated at least two individuals, one adolescent male and one young female. The ages were broadly consistent with Alexei at 13 and either Anastasia or Maria. The fragments were carefully packaged and sent to forensic laboratories. Whether DNA could be extracted from material this severely damaged by fire was, at that point, genuinely uncertain. The answer required the most advanced sequencing technology then available. Laboratory scientists found, when they applied the most advanced DNA sequencing technology available in 2008 and 2009, that the charred bone fragments from the second burial site contained enough recoverable genetic material to make a definitive identification, despite having been burned, buried, and exposed to the elements for 90 years. The samples were processed at two independent laboratories, the United States Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory and a facility in Austria. Two separate institutions were used deliberately to ensure results could be independently verified and that no single laboratory's methodology would be the sole basis for the conclusion. The technique applied was next-generation sequencing, a high-throughput method capable of reading millions of short DNA fragments simultaneously, assembling them into a coherent genetic profile even from severely degraded material. For fire-damaged samples, this approach recovers far more data than the older techniques used in the 1993 analysis. The mitochondrial DNA from the second burial matched the Romanov family sequence established through Prince Philip's reference sample, confirming maternal line connection. The Y chromosome DNA matched the male remains at the first burial site, establishing a biological link between both locations. The sex of one individual from the second site was confirmed as male, consistent with Alexei. The other individual was female. The findings were published in 2009 by a team drawn from Russia, the United States, and Austria. The research was peer-reviewed and the raw data made available for independent verification. The conclusion was unambiguous. The fragments were the remains of Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, most likely Anastasia, based on age characteristics of the female bone material, though the degree of fire damage prevented absolute certainty on that specific point. All 11 individuals who had been present in the Ipatiev house on the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, were now accounted for across 2 burial sites. None had escaped. The record, finally, was complete. Genetic researchers found, embedded in the DNA recovered from the Alexei remains, a specific mutation in the F9 gene, a mutation that causes hemophilia B, a condition in which the blood's ability to clot is severely compromised. And the presence of that mutation connected the story of the Romanovs to one of the most consequential genetic inheritances in modern European history. Hemophilia B is a recessive condition carried on the X chromosome. Females with one affected X chromosome and one normal X chromosome are carriers. They do not suffer the condition themselves, but can pass it to their sons. The son who inherits the affected X chromosome will have hemophilia B. There is no compensating second copy of the gene. Alexei's mother, Tsarina Alexandra, was a carrier. She had inherited the mutation from her maternal grandmother, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, who carried the mutation and passed it to several of her children, who carried it into the royal families of Spain, Germany, and Russia through the marriage networks of the late 19th century. The implications for the Romanov dynasty were profound. Alexei's hemophilia was severe. Any physical injury that caused internal or external bleeding became a potential crisis. The search for treatment, or anything that might relieve the symptoms, made the family vulnerable to the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian faith healer who appeared to provide some relief during Alexei's episodes, and whose hold over Alexandra significantly affected the political functioning of the imperial court in the years before the revolution. The DNA confirmation of Alexei's diagnosis closed that loop definitively. A mutation in a single gene, inherited through 4 generations of European royalty, had shaped the politics of an empire. Historical records found in the imperial archives and in the accounts of servants who survived the revolution describe the daily life of the Romanov family in the years before their arrest, and the contrast between the world they had inhabited and the basement where their story ended is one of the most striking in modern history. The Romanov court at the height of the empire was among the most lavish in the world. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg contained over 1,000 rooms. The family owned multiple palaces, including the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, where they spent much of their time and where the children were raised in a domestic atmosphere that was, by all surviving accounts, unusually warm and close-knit for a ruling family of that era. The Tsarina was deeply religious, following the Russian Orthodox tradition with an intensity that shaped the household's rhythms. The children were educated broadly, spoke multiple European languages, and maintained correspondence with relatives across the continent, including the British royal family, with whom they shared both blood and genuine personal affection. The practical consequence of their royal connections was visible in the evidence recovered from the burial sites. The daughters had sewn a substantial quantity of diamonds and other jewels into the linings of their clothing before being moved from Tobolsk, a precaution against the possibility that they might need resources if circumstances allowed escape. The concealed jewelry, inadvertently, had affected the events in the basement. The dense layers of fabric and stone had deflected initial shots, prolonging the events and increasing the chaos before the situation was resolved. The servants and the family physician, who died alongside the Romanovs, had each been given multiple opportunities to leave. Each had refused. DNA scientists found, in the complete accounting of the Romanov case, something that extended beyond the identification of 11 individuals in a Russian forest. A demonstration of what forensic science can return to history when politics and mythology have obscured it for generations. The formal state funeral for the identified Romanov remains was held in St. Petersburg in July 1998, 80 years after the events in Yekaterinburg. The service took place in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, the traditional burial church of the Russian Tsars. Russia's then President Boris Yeltsin attended and acknowledged the events of 1918 as a crime that required acknowledgement by the Russian state. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had canonized Nicholas II and his family as passion bearers, saints in the Orthodox tradition, in 2000, did not initially accept the DNA identification of the 1998 remains, citing concerns about the methodology. Further testing, conducted in 2015, using the most advanced sequencing technology then available and incorporating additional reference samples from living relatives, produced results that the Church acknowledged as conclusive. The identification of Anna Anderson as Franziska Shanskowska did not, for many people, immediately change a belief that had been held for decades. The story of the surviving princess had become too embedded in popular culture to be dislodged by a laboratory result. Films continued to circulate. Books that predated the DNA findings remained in print. But the science was not interested in the mythology. The bones were found, the sequences were read, the family was identified, and the question that had generated a century of speculation, did anyone escape from the basement of the Ipatiev house, was answered by evidence that does not change its answer based on how much someone wants it to be otherwise. No one escaped.